Okay, welcome to this panel. My name is Bob Sturm, and I'm an Associate Professor of Computer Science at the Royal Institutes of Technology, KTH, in Stockholm, Sweden. My research addresses applications of artificial intelligence to music, specifically in the music creation process and the variety of ethical considerations that entails. This panel, called Music as Experience in an Age of Artificial Intelligence and Computational Creativity, features 5 composers who have worked with and used AI in their creative work. The title of this panel alludes to John Dewey's Art as Experience, so I hope the conversation addresses the whole process of music creation, including conception, composition, performance, reception, revision, and so on. I don't want today's discussion to try to define artificial music intelligence because it distracts from the very interesting things composers and musicians are doing with AI as one tool of many. The 5 composers on the panel have all used AI in their work. So let's introduce ourselves, starting with Professor Jennifer Walshe.
Hi, Bob. Thanks very much for the invitation. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Oh, I can see. Thanks very much for the invitation. It's really nice to get together with a group of like-minded people who are all interested in AI and music. My background is I'm a composer, I'm a performer. I became interested in machine learning and artificial intelligence sort of in the last, I would say, maybe 8 years or so. And for me, initially when I was interested in working with machine learning, this was still at a stage where wavenets didn't exist and everything was about MIDI notation or ABC notation. And because I'm a vocalist that works a great deal with extended techniques and I do a lot of free improvisation, things really got interesting for me in the last 4 years when it became possible to work with raw audio and to do things live. So I know Bob will play a short video now, which is a project that I did. It was a collaboration with the artist and technologist Memo Acton. This was a commission from Somerset House Studios in London, and it's a project called Ultra Chunk, where for a year I made videos every single day, just shot with my webcam, of me improvising with my voice, and then Memo coded this configuration. I think it's about 6 different neural nets that work in tandem called GRANMA, granular neural nets for music and audio, and these work with me live. So as I'm performing with my voice live, these are responding to me. So I have this, I suppose this sort of brings together several different strands of why I'm interested in machine learning, in that I get to see the inside of it by having to make the corpus myself. And then I also get to feel what it's like to be a human performer performing with an intelligence which is not biologically human, and having this sort of space in sort of bringing the uncanny valley to the performance stage, and sort of feeling what it feels like to be improvising, to hear something listen to you and then stop listening to you, but to have this encounter with this other type of intelligence.
And next we'll continue with an introduction from Professor Robert Rowe.
Hi, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. So indeed, I was trained as a composer and have been working on algorithmic composition for 40 years. First started at the Institute of Technology in Holland, working with Dr. Artemi-Maria and Paul Berg, and others moved on from there to IRCAM, where I was able to start working on real-time applications of algorithmic composition. Went from there to the MIT Media Lab, where I wrote my dissertation on these kinds of systems that can listen to musicians in real time and respond to them based on some of the musical aspects of what the musicians are doing. My first book, Interactive Music Systems, was based on that. I was working with Marvin Minsky at the time, certainly informed my ideas about artificial intelligence as they relate to these topics. Moved on from there to New York University in the music technology program, where I have been ever since. Wrote a second book, Machine Musicianship, that Bob referred to earlier. Perhaps I'll drop in just a bit of audio from an improvisation I did with Steve Coleman and Muhal Richard Abrams at the BANFF Center in 1989. At NYU, we have been heavily involved with machine learning and in particular deep learning in the Music and Audio Research Laboratory, about $10 million in NSF funding to explore various aspects of that. Recently, particularly with environmental sound, since there's money to there's more music, unfortunately, at least in the US. But I think maybe the most important thing, at least what feels most important to me right now, is I've just started teaching a class called Music, the Mind, and Artificial Intelligence for undergraduate students, 18 and 19-year-olds, to try to get them to understand what AI is, what it can do, and what it can't do. As I say to them, it's going to be one of the defining aspects of their lives, and they need to understand it. There is so much misunderstanding about what these systems are really capable of that is very dangerous. I don't think the danger comes so much from the fear of superintelligence as it does from people attributing much more intelligence to these things than they actually have. So teaching 18 and 19-year-olds not only to use magnetic plugins, but what they're doing, how to understand them, and how to train their own models to make them useful.
And next, we'll have an introduction from Oded Ben-Tal.
Hello. I'm a composer and researcher. I actually am collaborating with Bob, where we actually met back in the 1990s at Stanford at Karma. I'm using kind of intelligent or demi-intelligent things, first like Robert and Jennifer, in kind of live interactive situations where I want the computer to react intelligently, musically to the input signal. But since like 4 or 5 years, Bob and I have started this project of applying machine learning to a corpus of folk music, originally Irish, and now we gradually are expanding. And Bob is going to play a short excerpt from the first piece I wrote using this approach, where material generated by a system trained on Irish folk music is generating things, and I work with them, and I titled the piece Bastard Tunes in the kind of original way of the meaning bastard, that it's kind of the illegitimate offspring of me and an artificial intelligence.
And let us move to introduction from Artemi.
So good afternoon from me as well. I am a composer and artistic researcher, and my research explores not only compositional applications of AI and machine learning in particular, but also the potential of machine learning to shape musical thinking, to shape compositional thinking. So I am interested in the relation between computational tools and technical possibilities on the one hand, and compositional affordances on the other hand. So in other words, I'm interested in exploring whether and how machine learning and artificial intelligence can lead to the emergence of new artistic concepts and practices. In my compositional practice, I focus on the interaction between human musicians and interactive music systems that use machine learning to process and to collect and process information from their environment. I call this type of compositions interactive compositions. Of course, the type of computer music system that is involved in these compositions is not a system that is meant to be used in an improvisational context. So these systems are designed for the needs of a specific composition, of a specific compositional idea, which means that their behavior is very idiosyncratic. And this, in combination with the score, allows the piece to maintain its identity, while at the same time enabling the musician and the interactive music system to make decisions in real time and to determine the course of the performance. So in a way, its instantiation of the work is the result of collaborative and collective creativity between human or among human and non-human agents. The piece we are going to hear next is such an interactive composition for human and robotic percussionists, and it's called Imitation Game.
Okay, let us now hear from the final panelist, Shelly Knotts.
Hi, I'm Shelly. I am a postdoctoral researcher and I'm currently based at Durham University in the UK. And I'm working on a project there called Mimic, or Musically Intelligent Machines Interacting Creatively, which is a bit of a mouthful. And this project is about developing an accessible web-based platform for the creative use of machine learning, machine listening, and live coding. And the part of that project that I work on is about machine listening with the researcher Nick Collins. That's the British Nick Collins, not the American one. And as part of that research, we've also conducted a survey on sort of trying to gain some perspectives on how much people are actually using music AI software in their work, and also their attitudes to AI. So I'm happy to sort of talk about that as we go along. As well as being a researcher, or like as part of my research, I'm also a musician and improviser. I work primarily in live coding performance, and also on network music, collaboration, and improvisation. And sort of to talk a little bit about how I've used AI in my work, I think it's not really a term that I tend to associate with my work, maybe largely for some of the reasons that Robert talks about, that there's a lot of sort of obfuscation with the term AI, that it doesn't really describe what's going on in the background. And I think some people kind of often use it as a way to sort of like hype the work or market the work, rather than to talk about what they're actually doing. So yeah, a lot of the work I'm doing is to do with machine listening and sort of small data sets, and sort of driving creative processes with small amounts of data. I'm sort of driven by sort of the desire to have the computer to do things that I don't expect, and sort of have some agency and to intervene in creative and collaborative processes. And in general, as a performer, I don't really want to be fully in control of the systems that I'm performing with. So I want there to be some sort of sense of collaboration in the same way that you would have when you're performing with jazz musicians or other types of human musicians, is what I'm trying to recreate with those performance systems. And I'm also doing work that's often sort of quite implicitly or sometimes explicitly critical of sort of how we're interacting and working with algorithmic systems. So one piece I did was a work for a telematic female laptop orchestra, which was an algorithmic mixer, which was sort of like trying to question the ideas of like making an algorithm manage a collaboration, and sort of all the ideas around hierarchy and equality, and sort of bringing a programmer into a creative process that might bring up. And another work that I've done recently that I think we'll maybe hear a clip of is Algorithmic Girl, which is a piece that's sort of explicitly driven by punk music. So this was sort of supposed to be a little bit of a poke at the fact that a lot of sort of big data machine learning algorithms are driven by tonal music made by white men, and also to do with thinking about appropriation in the context of AI. So I sort of tried to do that by referencing the sound world and ideals of Riot Girl, which is a feminist punk music, and their sort of ideas around sort of seizing the means of production, and critiquing established male-dominated systems.
Okay, so thank you very much for those introductions. They were on point, on time, very relevant. Some things that I've noticed among all of your comments and some of the readings I've done is the use of AI to create worlds and explore artistic concepts that were not thought about. I would like for you each to reflect on your use of AI in your work and where you see it adding and where you see it detracting. And if I might be so cheeky as to specify an order in which you could respond, perhaps starting with Professor Walshe on that question.
I think a lot of composers view AI, it's almost like an extension of Cage's engagement with the I Ching. It's a way to add random elements or to sort of jog people out of a rut, you know, or to sort of you know, provide solutions compositionally that maybe you know, don't seem intuitive. And when I use the word intuitive, that already opens up a massive can of problematic worms, in that you know, of all, like, composers are trained early training for composers is really, really focused on a very specific way of writing harmony, of writing counterpoint and things like that. And so I think composers love that chance of being jolted out of that feeling. Whether or not they're writing tonal music that's fully notated, or they're working in maybe a sort of controlled improvisatory space or something like that. So for me, that was very much my interest, was a possibility to engage with something that I couldn't quite predict. I was also interested in it, in terms of it being a different type of intelligence, in that there's been loads of free improv players I've played with who said, okay, we're going to put this system and you can interact with it, and I've had fun doing that. But I think in terms of interacting with a machine learning system, I think almost like it's like interacting with a dog or interacting with the bacteria. I sort of see it from this sort of Donna Haraway cyborg manifesto perspective, where it's this opportunity to see how something thinks, like a different type of intelligence. And we don't expect dogs to think like us. And if you read people like Jacob van Oekschool, and he talks about the idea of the umwelt that an organism lives in, he's saying like a tick when it's on the end of a leaf, debating whether it's going to drop onto an animal or not. Its sort of inputs are very different to ours. Its notion of its environment and where it sits is very different to ours. So that's what was interesting to me, this sort of encounter with something else. And of course, I see the limits within those systems very quickly, and I see my own terrible limits and my own, bad habits and ruts and things like that. And it's an opportunity to jolt them out. So that's sort of one thing I'm interested in. But the other thing I'm also extremely interested in is that, and I'm very interested, Robert, I would love to see the syllabus for your class, because I'm a professor at a Hochschule, at a conservatoire. So I'm professor of experimental performance at the University for Music and the Performing Arts in Stuttgart in Germany. And the students that I teach there could be opera students, puppetry students, composition students, and I also teach students from the art school and from the design academy. So I have to teach this huge range of students, and I never know exactly who's going to wind up in the classroom. And I've been trying to think of ways and implementing ways to teach them about machine learning and to teach them about AI. And one of the things I keep saying to them is, you need to look at the nuts and bolts of how these things are made, because if you don't understand how a corpus is put together, then, as Shelly said, you end up with these corpus. We inherit these corpuses, corpi that already exist, that are loaded down with biases and all sorts of problematic thinking. And so I think Trevor Paglin's work on ImageNet is really fascinating, because it shows us how flawed that corpus is. So that's what I'm also interested in, is if you look at the nuts and bolts of how it's put together, instantly you start thinking about the archive and you start thinking about the canon, which means it's possible maybe decolonize the archive and the canon through the work that you're doing with AI. So you can sort of do a lot more. It sort of reaches out into the world, and it's something that's much, much bigger than the networks themselves, to encompass everything from race and gender to class and history.
Professor Rowe, would you like to continue?
Sure. Yeah, I would echo much of what Jennifer said, and I'd be happy to send you my syllabus. It's been a lot of fun. I would say that the real attraction and the thing that has kept me working on these things for 40 years now is the possibility to think a kind of design of meta systems. So thinking about systems that will create music rather than writing individual pieces, writing systems that are capable of producing a class of work. And what's involved with that kind of compositional thought, and what it makes possible in working with other musicians, so that they become confronted then with these systems, and what kind of sense do they make of them, what kind of music comes out of them that I may not have foreseen, certainly they have not foreseen. All of that I think is still the real magic of it. And the drawbacks, I would say, I would characterize them more as the challenges. I think that AI is at a huge crossroads right now, because AI has come to be more or less synonymous with machine learning, that has its fantastic possibilities, but also its real limitations. I think that music both spotlights those limitations and offers us a way to explore them and perhaps move beyond them. I think that music may be one of the most important research areas for AI right now, because the things that machine learning does not do well is it doesn't deal with hierarchy very well, it doesn't deal with change over time very well. And both of those things are exactly what we need to model music. In terms of the frightening aspects of it, I mean, the main example I use is Loomis versus Wisconsin, a U.S. Supreme Court decision that came down several years ago, in which there was a case where a man was convicted of theft. Prosecutor asked for a 5-year sentence. Judge pulls out his phone, looks out and picks up an app, plugs in the guy's gender, his age, his criminal history. Says, no, the app says 10. You get 10. He has no idea how the thing works, what it was trained on. It was probably trained on all the mistakes we've made in the past. This went up all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Supreme Court said, not a problem. He doesn't have to know. He doesn't need to know what it was trained on. His app says 10 years, it's 10 years. And that is just extremely, I mean, it could have been random numbers for all we know, probably practically was random numbers. And we have the opportunity. I mean, the other problem is very small data sets. If you're trying to recreate, the Beatles, there's 255 songs. It's not enough to be useful for the way these things work. How can we develop human in the loop, all these kinds of techniques that will allow us to steer these things over time? How do we incorporate domain knowledge? There's all these things that are directly applicable to music, and we can explore them in a way that won't result in a car driving into a wall or people getting shot. I think that the drawbacks are the way AI is being approached socially, but I think that we're in a unique position to try to make some progress.
Thank you for that, and highlighting the fact that music provides a very good playground for exploring many of these technologies. We'll return to the question of who is allowed to explore applying AI to music in terms of engineers being not educated in music later. But continuing the conversation of what adds and detracts to your own artistic work with AI, let's continue with Oded Ben-Tal.
So I'll echo Jennifer and Robert in that for me, it's a way of engaging with an other. It's something external. I would refine that in kind of two ways. One is, unlike Cage and the I Ching, the other we engage with does have kind of musical traces. It's not just an arbitrary set of constraints. There are kind of what's being thrown back at me has some resemblance or has some traces of human music activity. So it's a kind of a musical endeavor. The other thing that I found out is that it enables me to work a little bit like painters, in the sense that if I compose music in a normal way, it's all down to imagination. But unlike a painter who can put some paint on a canvas and kind of walk back and look at what there and kind of come back and do kind of an interactive loop of evaluating, seeing what's there and changing. This happens in electronic music if you're doing generating sound electronically, or when I'm kind of working with a machine learning system and looking at outputs generated by the system and then evaluating, say, no, this is worthless, or I can't do anything with it. Let's try tweaks to parameters and do more. So that's the part where I think is kind of changes the creative process for me, which is kind of useful to do as a composer. And that also relates to the kind of drawback or cause that it's just more time consuming. Getting to understand this machine learning, not so much understanding how it does, which is really tricky, but understanding what it can do for me involves a long generation process of perhaps hundreds of instances of short you know, a few bars of music. I'm working with Bob, and we're doing with symbolic music rather than audio. But similar kind of hundreds of times going over this iterative loop, and 95 or 99 out of those 100 are not much or useless, between useless and curiosities. But then there are some nuggets there that are kind of ways of moving forward, and then transforming them into music that I'm happy with is another step in the process. So it is a bit of a longer than just putting pen to paper or going into Super Collider and developing something which I already am familiar with. So this kind of unfamiliarity is costly in a sense.
Thank you very much. Let's continue hearing from Artemi.
Yeah, so what I find I'm becoming really interested in is not necessarily the capabilities of machine learning algorithms, but their specificities and also their limitations. So right now I'm writing a piece that is a comment on AI bias to some extent. I am training neural networks to predict my own aesthetic preferences. I have collected some recordings of improvisations with the clarinetist, because it's a piece for bass clarinet and electronics. And then I have just segmented these audio recordings and evaluated them based on my own subjective preferences on a Likert type scale. And then what I'm doing is I'm just using this material as training data for the neural network. The idea is that the neural network will evaluate the musician's input in real time during the performance, and will respond to sounds it likes, but will remain silent or propose different sound material when it is not so interested in the musician's input. Another interesting aspect of this piece is that the interactive music system has no sound material to begin with. So the idea is that the interactive music system will collect sound material during its interactions with different musicians. So there are two aspects that are really important to me in this piece. The first is that in this piece it's impossible to say where human agency ends and machine agency begins. So the decisions that the interactive music system will make during the performance cannot be traced back to the data that I provided entirely, because in a way my own bias, my own subjectivity is filtered through AI bias. And that's what I find very interesting, that in the end, what emerges through this process is a hybrid human and machine agency. And the other thing that this piece explores is the locus of authorship. So where does my authorship lie in this? My authorship just lies in the data that I provided, really, because I did not even provide sound material for the neural network. So just by providing these examples, I am developing an interactive music system that can first make aesthetically driven decisions, evaluate its interaction with the musician and aesthetically, and secondly, just collect sound material and build the piece starting from there, starting from just the neural network.
Okay, interesting. Shelly, would you like to continue?
Sorry, I'm not dealing very well with unmuting myself. Yeah, there were so many interesting perspectives there. It's hard to add to that, but I suppose maybe I'm just going to echo some of the things that have already been said, that what I'm interested in with AI is kind of systems that, as an improviser, will push me in new directions, stuff that I might not necessarily have thought of. When I go into an improvisation, that might push me somewhere new, into new territory. and also providing forms of feedback. So I have one piece which is maybe a little similar to what Artemi just described, where it's like trained on like a corpus of my own improvisations, and when I'm performing, it's basically trying to tell me how similar or different my performance is to stuff that I've done before, which isn't really AI as such, but it's sort of a sort of feedback system. So maybe if I find that I'm sort of repeating myself, I'm pushed into sort of a zone of thinking where I'm like, well, I need to do something new. So that's kind of an interesting piece for me to perform with an improviser. Yeah, and I guess also, I guess I'm interested in sort of abstracting aspects of collaborating with other improvisers into the computer system. So I'm thinking about collaborative improvisation and how I might want that to happen in collaborating with an algorithmic system that I'm programming myself. And in terms of detracting, I guess I'm kind of struggling a little bit with this. I guess some sort of things I can see is like it could be possible to sort of program sort of repetition or sort of creative ruts into your system. I'm also, I guess, interested in sort of black box, or interested in avoiding black boxes. So I'm a live coding performer, and like part of that style of performance is about revealing your code, and through that revealing your process and being extremely transparent about what's going on in your computer. And as soon as you get into working with big machine learning models and black boxes, you're like obfuscating so much about the process. And you're sort of throwing away, as a live coder, that transparency. So that's something that I suppose I'm sort of conscious of, like trying to avoid. And I think some other people talked like really nicely about machine learning and dealing with hierarchy and sort of social approaches to AI. So I don't want to repeat what's been said, but I also think that's interesting things to talk about.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I'd like to open it up to a more open format here and touch upon some of the ideas that you have offered. One is this idea of black boxes. I like the fact that you can train an AI on data. You don't really know what it's learned to do, but you can see some outputs. You can interpret that output. And engineers like to see, their algorithms getting the right answer, and the right answer is defined as whatever's in the training data. But when it comes to artistic practice, oftentimes it's hard to define what the right answer is. And even more paradoxically, the failure of an algorithm could be of benefit too, creatively. Right. So is anyone willing to respond to this idea of failure of models providing creative opportunities, or examples in their own work of such occurrences? Oh, yes, Jennifer.
I suppose one of the things that I'm interested in is how a lot of sort of off-the-shelf AI music generating apps and software are really full of failure and full of problems. And so certainly with some of the musicians that I work with, we sort of, to us it's like finding outsider art in a record bin, at a thrift store is when you are able to let it fail in that way, you can sort of show the audience that it's failing already, and you can show the audience like the limits of the software. So one of the last proper shows I played before lockdown, before everything shut down, was in Boston, and I was working with Wobbly, this San Francisco based musician who's really very concerned with machine listening, and MC Schmidt, a musician from Matmos. And so we weren't doing a show that was an AI themed show, and we weren't doing it to an audience of technologists. We were just doing it to a regular audience. But we were playing around with all these terrible apps. Like, I shouldn't say terrible apps in case I'm insulting the people who made them, but we were playing with these apps that were like using machine learning to write pop songs in real time, and we were able to see what pop songs they were using as the sort of the seed, and then I was improvising, trying to sing the original pop song but making it fit into the AI version. And so those sort of failure moments, and what normal musicians would say, this app doesn't work so well because I can hear shadows of the original, you know, in this new version, and so therefore it doesn't get me a brand new piece of music. In the improv world, they're just seen as like fun toys to play with, to mess around with the limits of what these things are capable of. So from that perspective, it's extremely rich, and I'm more interested in the failures than the successes. If it sounds just like top 40, it's not fun anymore, because then you can't play with it and point out to the audience what's weird about it.
Would anyone else like to respond?
I can add something. I mean, so again, going back to the project I did with Bob of the folk RNN, which trained on Irish tunes, and I was particularly interested in the non-Irish sounding things that the system could produce, because the kind of most of what comes out of the system is pretty generic and nondescript. And kind of self-identical in a sense. You've got things that are unmemorable and sound everything like itself. There are occasionally, as the album that we released showed, are kind of good tunes that people can, good Irish tune that fit within session music and can be fit into an album of session music. But for me, the most interesting things were things that kind of really deviated from the tradition just enough that it wasn't completely arbitrary or completely random, but had some traces of the original training data, but was sufficiently free of it that I could play around with it a lot. And the other example is this piece I just finished recently, which I tried to see what the Magenta tools that were released can do. It's a kind of different system that operates a bit differently than folk RNN. And one of the things I discovered that they have two options. They can generate melody or drums. And I think I was kind of mixing those two. So I was kind of taking a melody and asking Magenta to treat it as a drum and a reverse. And so things that were kind of not planned or not designed into the system produced for me the kind of most interesting or kind of most things with the most creative potential. Some of them are totally uninteresting in and of themselves, probably, but for me had a kind of creative potential because they're kind of unintended consequences of trying to subvert the system in a sense.
Yeah, I would echo some of what has already been said. Personally, since the opportunities for interaction are somewhat limited these days, I've been using some of these tools on recorded signals. So one of them is the system called EXCERPT that was developed here. It's a very good pitch tracker. But musically, some of the most interesting things that it produces are when it's very low confidence. So you can be getting the pitches, for example, I've been using it on a recording of the Debussy Syrinx. And at the phrase boundaries, where actually there's nothing being played, it does these fantastic things where it's just trying to figure out what the pitch could possibly be. Which for me is interesting because it's a way of introducing segmentation, trying to find a hierarchy in the structure of this music. But just from a pitch standpoint, the mistakes are the most fabulous things about it. But in general, I've been thinking a lot about the problem of, we all as composers, and it's a general, sort of process of people working this way, is that you tend to sit and wrestle with material until you get something that you think is compelling. And it's impossible for us to make a corpus of 50,000 examples that's going to train a meaningful machine the way that these things work now. But there are using interpretability, incorporating domain knowledge. But what I'm really interested in is these human-in-the-loop computing, where you train it on a relatively small data set, but then the model shows you which examples it's most confused about. And then you only have to identify those one or two, retrain, and then it shows you again something at the boundary. So even as individuals, we can get somewhere with these models without having to, contemplate the horror of generating 50,000 examples. We can work in an afternoon and get something advanced to the place that it might be able to do something useful. So being able to leverage the mistakes as a way to make it more possible for individuals to work with these systems is something I find very interesting.
Artemi and Shelly, you both wear two hats in terms of being a composer and being an engineer in developing these machine learning systems. How is it reconciling? Is it easiest to work with those two hats, or have you worked with machine learning engineers in creating some of the technology that you've applied to your music?
I can go first.
Okay.
So I'm actually not an engineer. I'm a classically trained composer, but I am programming and training my own neural networks. So I'm programming everything from scratch. And the reason for that is that I really don't like black boxes. I want to be able to understand how the algorithms work. I want to be able to understand how changing a single parameter can affect what the algorithm learns. So that was the reason I started programming the neural networks myself. But unfortunately, I have not been able to collaborate with engineers yet. I think this is terribly needed right now. Actually, I feel that engineers' interests and artists, researchers sometimes can be really far away. And I think that the field would definitely benefit from more collaboration between artists and developers.
Yeah, I guess I would also just add to that I'm also not really technically an engineer. I mean, I'm a trained musician who has done a lot of programming, but I don't really have any computer science background at all. And yeah, I also don't tend to work with engineers as such, and I don't know whether it's just some stubbornness on my part that if I'm building a system, I want to be able to build it myself and know how it works and be sort of involved in the entire process from sort of having the idea to how it plays out in performance. I suppose that's also a little bit like the live coder in me. And yeah, I just I guess I see the whole chain as part of the creative process, and so sort of giving that away to someone else and saying, okay, you program this part of it, seems like it doesn't quite work for how I work personally.
Okay, great perspectives. I would like to move to another topic, and that's the danger of involving AI in your work. We see a lot of media attention being devoted to the forthcoming superpowers of AI in a surveillance state. Robert mentioned the use of AI in sentencing people, predicting recidivism in crime, predicting crime, and so on. And in my own work, I wrestle with the development of AI. When I develop these technologies and I research them for music, am I somehow contributing to the surveillance state of testing these algorithms in such case? Even though music, working in the domain of music, is not going to kill somebody like an autonomous vehicle, there are still ethical issues involved in that. We see a lot of machine learning papers devoted to trying to reproduce Bach harmonizations, but also reproduce the Beatles. And of course, one composer is dead there, and others are living. The ethics of reproducing living artists and their voices carry some weight for me. Could some of you reflect on these ethical issues of involving AI in music? Shelly.
I'm happy happy to reflect on that. Yeah, I suppose I sort of like have a lot of sort of worries about big data, machine learning, and sort of not, I think we've already talked a little bit about that, about like not necessarily creating your own data sets and the amount of bias that's building into systems. And also, I guess, you know, the Google Magenta data algorithms have already been mentioned, and I suppose that's one example where you're talking about a huge tech corporation who's like appropriating giant amounts of data because they're probably like the only organization who has the time and resources to appropriate that amount of data, and then that's being baked into a lot of AI creative music systems. And yeah, I guess we have to ask like what it is that we're baking in there. And I think there's like a lot of examples from other fields where there's sort of been some problematics with that. So I think there was a recent story about image data set which had like huge and problematic amounts of racism built into the data set because the labeling included like really offensive terminology, and yeah, not having sort of a check on that and not knowing like where the data has come from and whether the people have consented to that, I think is just like hugely problematic. Yeah, I also read of another example recently where some researchers wanted to make a machine learning algorithm and they needed copyright-free data. And because a lot of European and Europe and America have really tough copyright laws, they took musical data from a country that has lesser copyright laws and used that as their data set. And like the artists who contributed to that were not credited or recompensed for what they had contributed. So I think there's quite a lot of big ethical questions about sort of that amount of like appropriation in terms of the data sets that we're using.
Well, I would just say that the other nice thing about working with the 18 and 19-year-olds is they bring me stuff that I wasn't aware of myself. And one was this video called Travis Bot. Everybody else may have known about this, but I hadn't seen it before. But it was recreating the style of Travis Scott without using any of his own material. So it trained a model, and then it output this material, both visual and audio, that replicates his style. And one of my colleagues is Lawrence Ferrara, who is one of the leading so-called forensic musicologists, who testifies as an expert witness in copyright cases all the time. So I asked him, you know, and apparently Travis Scott had nothing to do with this. It wasn't asked for permission. And I asked whether he would have a case, a copyright infringement case. And Larry's, you know, just over email take was that he would not have a copyright infringement take because there were no samples of Travis Scott's work used in the video, but he would have a trademark infringement case. That's just trying to make it look like Travis Scott was enough to infringe his trademark, but not his copyright. So yeah, there's a huge problems with all of this stuff. You know, we've already talked about the racism, sexism, all of the if you're going to use huge data sets of human decisions from the past, you're just going to cook in all of the human mistakes from the past. So, you know, again, I'm hopeful that music might be a way that we could explore techniques for mitigating some of these problems, but the problems certainly exist nonetheless.
I think that these problems, my sort of view is that like each problem that we have with these ethics, they create new, very interesting projects. So what you're saying, Robert, about, you know, getting a forensic musicologist to look at Travis Bot, this extends that project, you know, and makes like a new project that adds on to that. That's completely fascinating. And I think that's how I try to view it, is that like if we really, and I know I was saying this earlier, this idea of looking at the nuts and bolts of how these things are made, there's possibilities for intervention, there's possibilities for interesting questions to be sort of unteased. And there's a project I've been doing at the moment which is taking forever because we're building a corpus of all text scores that have been written. So everything has to be transcribed by hand. The folders are a total mess of like Word documents, PDFs, JPEGs, TIFFs, oral descriptions, handwritten scans of PDFs from the 60s, and we're putting it all together, and then just even to decide what the metadata tags would be was a huge, like days of discussion. But by putting it together, this issues of authorship, these issues of like, is it okay to use people's scores to train it on? Those have all come very much to the fore. And what it's made us think about very much is that like the entire text score tradition, and I'm really thinking like from Fluxus onwards, but some sort of early performances of Dada, that's sort of like a mythology, it's sort of a folklore. So most of the experimental composers I know, that to them is their Brothers Grimm, that's sort of what they were raised on, and it's in their DNA. And when they're writing to that tradition, they know they're participating in that tradition. And they're often even using exactly the same syntax, the same vocabulary as people did 50 years ago or 60 years ago. And the solution Ragnar, my assistant, came up with was, he said, we need to make this project exist on the blockchain so everybody can buy tokens invested in the project by investing their scores in the project. But we were like, we don't have the money to, you know what I mean, to make this. But even to me, Ragnar's concept of like making a text score machine learning project exist on the blockchain is important, because we start to think about these issues of who wrote these works, how are they contributed, how does the community use them. When even my students are introduced to text scores for the first time, it sort of blows their minds and they all start writing them. But they're often writing things that are echoes of stuff from Lamont Young's anthology 1960, which itself is a collection of pieces by other people. So I think I always think like there's loads of projects in the cracks, if that makes sense. There's ways for people to sort of be involved with AI, and I always say to my students, you don't need to learn to code to have an investment in this project. Your phone's doing it anyway, like right now, so you're already involved in it. But if you just try to learn how it's put together, straight away there'll be really interesting things that you can sort of draw out and turn into projects.
So I just wanted to add that legal and ethical issues aside, I think that the ability of AI to reproduce the styles of human artists might actually help enhance our creativity. Georgina Bourne writes that each musical work exists in continuation of a musical past and in anticipation of a musical future. And I think it's this anticipation and it's this speculation about the future that is the most important part of the creative process, and that will become increasingly important. So I think that as computers get better at imitating, we will get better at innovating.
It's a good point to move to the future. In Robert's book from 2004, Machine Musicianship, he writes in chapter 1 that a large part of the motivation for making music with computers is that computers are less troublesome to employ than people. And talking about, we see the redundancy of people in positions because their work is being automated. Several of you are educators of musicians and composers, and some of you are being trained in composition. So what do you think the future holds for your ability to make a livelihood, or your students' ability to make a livelihood, as more and more of the music creation process is automated?
Well, as the one who wrote those words, I would point out that I went on to say that my own work is against that idea. Just because computers are less troublesome to employ doesn't mean we should. Actually, what I said was that there is no meaning to machine music unless it engages a human culture. So that we have to find ways to make the machines interact with and be meaningful to human partners. So in my own work, that's why it has always involved interaction between humans and machines. But that's where, that's another reason to be teaching these students how to use these tools. I think that the tools are far away from being able to create meaningful musical experiences the way that humans do. I think that they can certainly contribute to that process and add even expertise, let's say automatic mastering we don't credit all of the plugins that we use. We're already far down the path of machines contributing in a very integral way to the products that we're listening to. But I have not yet heard, and don't believe I'm going to hear for quite a while, a machine all on its own produce music that is as interesting and compelling as what humans can do on their own, or what humans almost uniformly do in collaboration with machines. So what's to be training the musicians of the future, as we're all doing, is teaching them how to understand those machines and how to use them and how to let them empower us to make our own expression.
I think like Robert, I'm very much doubtful that we're entering an era where music will be automatically generated at the press of a button. Where I do think there is a big difference is that the kind of skills required for working in music are going to continue to develop. The skills that were needed 100 years ago are different from the skills were needed 50 years ago, from 10 years ago, and 10 years in the future. And I think as educators, that's the key issue, that we need to prepare or get our students thinking about what will be the skills they need and the career path, which I think what machine learning is going to change is probably some of the career path, especially kind of the entry-level jobs that are currently done by people, by graduating students, or in the early stage where they learn on the job some of the skills that eventually they can develop, of working in the studios and in small media companies, how to get some of these. And these are things that, as Robert said, some of them are kind of being automated away. But that doesn't mean that there won't be new ways of making music. And I think that's the key issue. The idea that machines can imitate what we currently do, even if that is successful, which we are all doubtful about, I think, does not mean that in 20 years' time, none of us will be needed at all, because our own demand, our own thinking about what is music, what is musically possible, what is the music we would like to listen to, our own creativity as listeners, as performers, as composers also moves with the technology. So it's just about finding innovative ways, like we talked about, kind of various failures that inspire us, and there will be other failures, like turntablists discovered that while most people just play vinyl records for their playback capabilities, you can also subvert that in sort of very interesting ways, and it opened new ways of making music that were not available before that. So like all technology, it can be used in multiple ways, and human innovation and capability for creativity moves with that and adapts to that new technological environment. That's where we need to point our students to. This is what we think is coming here, and these are, like Robert said, these are the skills, these are the kind of new systems you have to start thinking about and have to get your hands on to be able to be a productive and interesting musicians in 10 years' time.
I think that for me, when I talk to my students about the future, which is very strange because what I talked to them about as the future 6 months ago is not what I talk to them about now in late July 2020. But I always say to them, look, I doubt that during our lifetime there's going to be a sort of an autonomous AI that's writing music that's at a level that a human can, that is indistinguishable. But that doesn't matter, because right now AI is affecting every aspect of your daily life. It's, my students, I always say to them, how do you pay for music? Because they're studying to be musicians, and I say, how do you pay? Who do you pay, and how do you pay? And most of them are on Spotify or YouTube. and they're not paying musicians directly, you know, so they're not using Bandcamp, for example. They're using Spotify and YouTube, and there is so much AI baked into Spotify and YouTube, deciding what we're served, how we're served it. And in the same way that, you know, there's been fantastic work done on how YouTube can sort of steer you into a right-wing rabbit hole, it can also do that musically on Spotify, not into a right-wing rabbit hole, but it can sort of steer you down certain genres or certain styles. And because I do a lot of projects with a lot of different music, there's times where my algorithm is completely awful and completely terrible. Like I've trained the algorithm in a really bad way because I've listened to too much weird different music, and I'm getting served really weird things, and I know that from day to day. I also think AI is baked into Facebook, and a lot of discussions about what music is, where music should go, Adorno, yes, no, that's all happening on Facebook. Like, new music, in a way, has sold its soul to Facebook because it has made that the repository of a certain type of argument, which is often presented as a discussion rather than an argument. So that's already happening. It's already in there, and it's been enough to already change how music functions. The last thing I'd add to that is that what AI is doing well for music is writing sort of passable background music that can be in the back of a YouTube video that's about, like, how to make pasta, or, you know, a cool new eyeshadow. And because so much video is uploaded to YouTube every single day by influencers, and they need music that doesn't have copyright restrictions, like the company Juke Deck, this London startup, they were saying that's our market. Is we're not writing music for musicians, we're writing it for YouTubers, you know, who have another 20-minute update about what the family are doing and need to have like an epic guitar, inspirational, uplifting guitar music to put in the background of it. So it's already there and it's already happening. And I think the first people that I say to my students, if you're interested in doing film music or you're interested in doing TV or commercial music, it would be smart to be up on this stuff, because you'll probably use these tools rather than being Hans Zimmer and having like a live, you know, group of 100 people that are writing, you know, emotional theme 47C. You'll just sort of generate a bunch of stuff, and then you'll sort of tweak it and expand it and pull it apart and make it even better. But it'll give you so much raw material for temp tracks, for example, that like it doesn't need to be human level just for a temp track. So I think that's where I view it actually, that the real work on AI and music will happen in this sort of commercial YouTuber background space, rather than, you know, I don't think anybody's coming for the music that is played at Darmstadt, or, you know, is played in like in New York in the Stone, or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of agree with all the things I've said so far, and I think I would just like add maybe a slightly optimistic note that I think one of the things that AI doesn't take away from us is performance. Like, there's still a like theatricality that's very attractive to other humans, of watching another human on stage doing a performance and possibly crashing and failing horribly, that you just, I mean, as a live coder, we already have like the criticism that it's kind of boring to watch someone with a laptop, and I think it's even more boring to just watch a laptop on its own making music. So yeah, I'm actually quite optimistic about the future of our interaction with AI, because I don't think humans are going to suddenly stop wanting to see other humans doing performances.
That brings us to the...
Hey, Bob, can I respond briefly to Shelly, or
Yes.
kind of ask a kind of question? So I was kind of imagining someone like going into a club situation, and there is just a laptop and the screen is projected, and someone remotely turned it on, and then the code starts spewing on the screen like live coding, but it does it all on its own. And I think that could be a kind of interesting performatively, even when there's no human involved. So actually, in that sense, I think, I mean, to me, it would probably maybe even be more interesting to see it done without the hands typing, which don't add much. So maybe that's a kind of yes/no question, or yes/no option or potential.
Yeah, it's funny. There's already some live coders who've written systems that sort of autonomously code their own live coding music without human intervention, and they are actually kind of funny and entertaining performances, I have to admit, but they're also, you know, trained on quite small data sets, because I mean, there's not like a huge amount of live coding, so yeah, it's kind of funny to think about like what's gone into that system and whose live coding is it trained on, and but yeah, I think I'm still like kind of, when I'm watching those performances, still thinking about the human effort that's gone into creating it, and where the system is sort of failing because it doesn't have the same sort of critical judgment as a human would have.
That brings us to the near conclusion of this panel. I would like to ask if there are any final reflections on your part or responses to some of the points raised.
I would just say thank you for organizing this. It's been very interesting. And concluding remark would be that musicians should get involved. There's nothing scary or overly daunting or unlearnable about any of this stuff. It's actually, I think of it as, you know, at one point the engineers gave us the fast Fourier transform, and we were able to think about sound in a new way and compose sound, and people learned to use those tools, and now they think of them as a very normal part of their toolbox, and they should think about machine learning the same way. We're being given extremely powerful tools for free that anybody can learn, and musicians should do it.
I agree completely. I think it's really important for musicians to engage with it. I often say to my students, if you're interested, Cadenza, there's a Rebecca Fiebrink course on machine learning for artists, so super easy and accessible. But the way I often frame it to my students, and this goes off what Shelly was saying about this nightclub with the laptop playing alone, is I know a lot of you described yourselves as researchers, and I'm not a researcher. I sort of think of what I do as writing science fiction, and so it's just trying to sort of do thought experiments. And I remember reading Dropout by Cory Doctorow, and there's a scene in a nightclub near the beginning where he says it's not a DJ that's playing, it's something called like System 53 or something like that. I've completely misremembered the name. But he's saying, oh yeah, it's running LiDAR on the crowd to accelerate the beats according to the entire energy in the room, the way a human DJ would read the room and think, okay, now, it's this part of the night, I should up the BPM or down the BPM. And so I think that I'm sort of saying to my students, you don't have to make an AI piece using AI and learn how to code, but if you learn about it, you'll get an idea, and then you basically write a piece that is sort of a science fiction story in disguise, and that's the way that you sort of engage with it. So I find myself recommending Ted Chiang an awful lot at the moment as sort of like gold standard person, to talk about, or William Gibson also to talk about these issues with, because I think we all have to think them through together. Whether they come for our jobs in our lifetime or not, they're already in our phones, they're already in our laptops, like Robert said, with just even the plugins that we use. So why wouldn't you want to think about these things? It's part of everyday life.
Yeah, I would maybe just like to reiterate what's already been said a few times, that it's kind of, I feel like there's some urgency to having more critical perspectives on AI, and I think artists are like well positioned to be giving those creative perspectives, and also sort of introducing those concepts to people who aren't necessarily thinking about AI in their day-to-day lives, through concerts and performances, and through like sort of talking about presenting AI in different formats. So I think there's a lot of interesting work to be done there, and I think it would be great to have more creative and critical perspectives on AI.
So I would say that, yes, I think it'll be good for musicians to get involved. I think it's more than just it'll be interesting and you can achieve good things. I think the field is defined too much by the engineering side. Kind of, it's driven by what engineers think music is and what applications engineer thinks people would like to use. And unless and until more musicians of various hues get involved and kind of shape how the kind of research progresses and what kind of the research agenda, we're kind of, in a sense, we are kind of losing part of our ability to make music or to kind of engage with the future of where music is heading. So I think it's more than just, it's a fun, interesting tool to use. It's almost like an existential imperative for future of music, for musicians to engage with it, kind of performers, composers, listeners, kind of in all sorts of ways we can engage with kind of shaping where the research is heading. And we don't have full control of it, but I think getting involved is better than avoiding.
Thank you very much for those uplifting messages and call to action, so to speak, to get involved. You're all models, examples for budding musicians willing and able to explore machine learning in their own artistic work. I hope you stay safe and healthy, enjoy the rest of the summer, and hopefully we'll meet you in person soon again. Cheers.